Morning. How's everybody doing this morning? Good? Okay. Well, I think we've still got quite a few people still trickling in. I know the traffic was pretty bad, but we'll go ahead and get started. My name is William Golden. I'm the Executive Director of the Immersive Technology Conference. We created this conference technically 3 years ago to give business and enterprise class VR an event all its own to showcase the solutions that are out there, what it can do, and to interest companies who are working in this or in the fields that can most benefit from the technology. So to that end, this is our second year. I want to thank everyone for coming. Personally, I know if you're a Houston native, it's been a really rough year for all of us. So personally, I thank every one of you for showing up and everyone who's not here. It really shows that everyone believes in the technology. So really thank you guys for coming out. And then I'll go ahead and introduce our first keynote speaker, Tip-a-Tat, a man who needs very little introduction, but take it away.
Hello, thank you for having me. This is actually my first time in Houston, and I'm honored to be here, the home of the World Series winning Astros. That's pretty cool. So I have a presentation. I'm going to talk to you about the current state of VR and AR, what we've seen as an investor, what's been most exciting, kind of take a little bit of like, what are the learnings and how do we kind of move forward in space, and just some advice from what I've seen talking to a lot of startups and investing in a lot of startups. So for those that don't know me, I'm Tip-a-Tat. I am the general partner of the Venture Reality Fund. We are a $50 million fund that invests in early stage AR and VR startups only. We're based in Silicon Valley, but we invest globally. We've actually done 2 investments in Austin. We've also done investments in Helsinki, in Tokyo, and of course, all over in California. I actually graduated from Stanford. I'm not a finance guy, even though I'm a VC, I'm a VR guy. My degree's in HCI, Human Computer Interaction. I've been 3D artist, creative director, programmer, developer, and then CEO of my own little startup. And someone was asking me earlier, how did I get excited, or when did I really jump into VR? It was in the Kickstarter, when John Carmack said, hey, there's this thing called the Oculus, and it's legit. I was like, dude, what John Carmack says is worth like 350 bucks, okay? And so then when I got the Kickstarter thing, I tried it, and honestly, it made me sick. I was like, oh my God, VR is gonna come, it's gonna be so awesome, and I can't participate. But then I realized, oh, it's just because I connected to my Mac, and my Mac sucked. And then I got a decent computer, and then once they announced like positional tracking was coming, I started experimenting and just building like weird VR experiments. Most of them were pretty bad, but then there was one that I was really proud of. I worked with another artist named Eric, and we tried to recreate the movie The Matrix, because a lot of people were like, oh hey, let's go to places in VR. And I'm like, oh, I love The Matrix, let's go into The Matrix. So we created this thing. It was kind of like an interactive movie simulator, almost like in Ready Player One. You have to, you are Neo, you have to act out the scenes, you meet Morpheus, he talks to you, he tells you the world's a computer simulation. And then we also had the parts where, oh, you have positional tracking. That means you could actually dodge the bullets and playing around with things like that. And one part of it was we wanted to make the jump program, because in VR, scale is so powerful. So in the jump program, just like in the movie, everyone fails the first time. So you run, you jump, and this was actually controller-based because that's all the input we had at the time. But when you jump over the building, if you look down, you actually fall 40 stories and you bounce off the ground. So I just programmed this thinking it'd be a fun experience, and the crazy thing that happened to me was, I don't know how or why, but I accidentally cured myself of my real-life fear of heights. And that proved to me that VR was something so powerful, something so new, and that would be a force for good, not just for gaming and entertainment, but also for the way that we learn, the way that we communicate, and the way that we work. So that's when I really decided I wanted to be an investor, and I want to do something different, and I really want to impact the space in a broader way. So I've now looked at over 3,000 startups in the space in the past almost 3 years that I've done this journey. I've been fortunate enough to invest in 21 companies. I speak at a lot of VR and AR conferences all over the world. I've actually lost track of how many I've been at so far. I think it's past 60. And I also mentor VR and AR incubators worldwide. But that's enough about me. I just want to tell you who I am. But the one thing that bothers me is, like, earlier this year in particular, everyone's saying VR is dead. People were talking about, like, oh, headset sales are low, VR already lost its chance. TechCrunch in particular was just like, oh yeah, this cycle of VR is over. What do we do? But like this actual fake Mark Twain quote, the reports of the death of VR have been greatly exaggerated. I'll tell you why. So it's true. The 2016 numbers of headsets were relatively modest, especially compared to what the analysts were overhyping. There were a lot of people like, oh my God, the first year of VR is going to sell like 30 million. And it was kind of weird because if you actually talk to any of the headset manufacturers, they're like, we couldn't even make that many if we tried because we're all using these OLED displays and all these new components. It's very tricky. But, I mean, it was still pretty modest, right? But what's really interesting too is, what we've seen in the past years. So that was 2016 numbers. But so far in 2017, we're already on track to see 2x growth. So it's not that it's dead, it just has a slower start. But the fact that we're seeing 2x growth in the next year shows that it's working. Now the other thing I want to talk about is looking at hardware sales and hardware numbers. That's important, but it's only part of the picture. Equally, if not more important, is software sales. And how are companies doing in this ecosystem? So I'm going to tell you a quick little story. It's about the Nintendo Wii. Arguably one of the most successful video game consoles of all time. I think it sold, I don't know, like 80 million units or something like that. But what's interesting about it is, it was a great product for Nintendo, but it was a terrible platform for developers. Because what ended up happening was, if you didn't have Mario or Zelda or the Nintendo brand, it was very hard to sell games on that ecosystem. And honestly, Wii Sports was such a good game, most people didn't even bother buying another game. And so what ended up happening was, most third-party developers couldn't make money. And in fact, it was so bad, EA, one of the biggest game publishers, said, hey, we're not even gonna support the Wii U, your next system, because we got screwed over by the Wii. And so that's an example of a great product, but a terrible platform. If software companies can't develop and make money off that ecosystem, off that hardware, then there's no developer ecosystem, and that is really a problem. But we're seeing the opposite in VR. So what I want to talk to you about is, there's been over 36 titles that have sold over $1 million, even in this early stage of VR. And that's great. That means the average revenue per user is high. People that have VR, they love it, they support it, they want to try different experiences. And so it's not that people don't love VR, it's just that not enough people have exposure to proper VR and have access to it and are engaging with it. But what's also interesting is, okay, so we're seeing this breakdown. Steam, there's over 18 titles. 9 of them actually have generated over 2 million in revenue. What's awesome is most of those titles too, I'd say over 60% of those titles, cost less than $1 million to make. So those companies are actually profitable and doing well. Oculus Store has over 8 titles. And then PlayStation Store, it's hard to get the data, but we estimate over 10 titles have sold over $1 million. And these are VR-only titles. I'm not talking about games like Resident Evil, which sold, I don't know, I think they counted like 25 million copies and generated a crazy amount, but it had VR and non-VR, so I don't really count that. I'm just talking about VR-specific titles. And if we look at the top selling titles in Steam VR, what's interesting is too, it's not just gaming, and it's not just stupid shooter games. It's a combination of a lot of different things. I mean, of course we do have shooters, but we have art programs, we have Job Simulator, which is its own kind of category, Audio Shield, which is music game, Virtual Desktop, which is productivity app, Star Trek, which is a Starship Simulator, Gallery, which is an exploration kind of Myst style game, an adventure game. And so you see a lot of diversity. And so I think what's really interesting too is the sense of, it's not just this idea of, hey, we need AAA first-person shooters and that's what's going to make VR a success. If we look at the early data, it's saying that, honestly, this is a new platform. There are no rules. Anything can exist, and anything can succeed. Oh, sorry. I think I just turned it off. So the other thing, too, that's very interesting and what's helping VR adoption grow is that there were price cuts earlier this summer. So the Oculus was the first. They dropped their price down from almost in half. Then the HTC followed suit, and the PlayStation dropped their price a little bit. But what was really interesting, it really helped the sales. Over here, originally the Vive was outselling the Oculus 2 or 3 to 1. And then by the end of the summer, you can see there's almost parity between the two. And so HTC continued to sell well, but then it was really the Oculus selling so much better that they caught up in installs. And then what's also really interesting is we haven't even talked about the Windows awful name mixed reality headsets, which are really VR headsets. But what's great about these are they're super cheap, but if you ask any developer, they're surprisingly good. And most importantly, they have inside-out tracking, which means you don't have to set up external sensors, so it's much easier to set up and deploy. But then the other thing is, it's slightly higher resolution, which means text is legible, and that's going to be great for all the enterprise VR companies. Because now you can actually big picture, that's what everyone's really talking about and going towards, right? And there are dev kits available. The HoloLens was released over a year ago. But it will require new devices. But that also means a new app store. And so you won't be competing for attention with all the different legacy apps that exist. And it offers the high immersion, and hopefully will have natural gesture control. This is something that we haven't seen yet in the AR dev kits, but I'm hoping, crossing my fingers, that that will be there when the final product ships. But what I'm trying to say is this. I feel like VR is kind of in this weird cycle now where a lot of people have written off VR. Then the problem is the people that write off VR, the reason why they're running it off is because they overhyped VR, right? And now they're like, oh, VR isn't where we predicted, because we were thinking, oh man, 100 million units by the end of day one, or at the end of year one. And now these people are overhyping AR, and especially mobile AR, and saying, oh my God, mobile AR is here, everyone do something. And it's just like, guys, come on, we've been here before. Calm down, and instead of focusing on what's new and shiny, let's actually start thinking about what's really valuable for our customers or for our players, and build something great. And what I would say is, VR is here, and we can do it. The tools are great, the platforms are great, and honestly, the audience is ready. If you build something good, you can actually sell it and get paid. So, forget the hype. VR is doing fine. VR and AR will take time, but it's worth it. To succeed in VR and AR, you have to build VR and AR native, and that means really understanding why you're doing this in VR in the first place. I think one of the biggest things, I'm sorry I didn't really talk about this, but I meant to, was a lot of startups I meet, they'll pitch me these ideas, and they just are like, well, I don't know if it's actually better in VR, or if this even makes sense. And the big thing about that too is, it can't just be a little bit better. It has to be like 10x better. It can't be something, oh hey, will I pay $5 for this or $20 for this? You have to think, will I spend $1,000 to $2,000 for this? Because a lot of times you have to convince someone to buy the VR set too. And that's how you have to think in this early stage of the market. And this is just a preference thing, but hopefully I showed you with the list of top 10. No more shooters. I mean, there are a couple shooters on that list, but what's interesting is, if you compare the numbers of shooters that are on that list to the number of shooters that are available, it's actually a very small amount of shooting games that succeed. And the other thing I want to say about this is really thinking about, okay, when we roll back to why VR and AR, instead of saying, hey, how can we make these games that are great a little bit better in VR, why don't we think about what games have never existed before that we now can finally create? And I think that we'll find much more impactful results. Something like Job Simulator, which again, if you explain to anyone and you had to use a controller and play it standardly, they'd be like, wow, that seems terrible. But when you play it in VR, you're like, oh my gosh, this is magical. And what's great about it is it's proven to be successful. Before we started this, people are like, oh, this is kind of cool, but is this really gonna work? But the audience has spoken. It's probably one of the most successful VR games on all the platforms. Alchemy Studios, within a year of VR launching, said they had already made over $3 million in the space, which is insane. And they eventually got acquired by Google. But if that's not a success for a startup, I don't know what is. That's the thing I would follow. Instead of saying, hey, how can we, try to be the next Call of Duty? No, think about how can you be something even weirder and cooler than Job Simulator. Don't overhype AR. I think I mentioned that at the very end. And I think this is the most important thing. Keep on evangelizing. I've personally given over 5,000 demos to people in VR, showing both my own terrible work, but more importantly, other people's better work. And one of the cool things about it is, you make a friend for life. They're so grateful. And I've been doing this for like about 3 years now, and what's funny is now I've been going to conferences, and people actually come up to me and they're like, oh my gosh, I remember you. You gave me my first demo in VR, and now I'm working in VR. And you're like, wow, that's awesome. That's amazing. And so I think, it's very satisfying. So, be sure to show people what VR is all about. Put them into Tilt Brush, into Google Earth, show them all the weirdness and the greatness and the wonderful things, and get their ideas flowing. Think about what they can do in VR. And think about how VR can spread beyond just this first wave that we've created. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. I think we're going to do a Q&A after, but up next is the amazing Ken Pye. Thank you very much. Oh, don't forget, I do this every time. I like to take a 360 photo of her before I speak. Ready? 1, 2. Nice. Thank you for going.
Awesome.
Hi, I'm just waiting on the slides. I'm Ken Pye, and I'm going to be talking to you today. I listen to a lot of World Series. How many people are here from Houston? I'm curious. Wow, okay. Congratulations. It was quite an epic series. So, it's pretty awesome. All right, so my name is Ken Pye, and I do the Voices of VR podcast. And so for the last 3.5 years, since May of 2014, I've done over 800 interviews in the virtual reality community. And so today, I'm going to be kind of peeling back, going behind the scenes a little bit from some of my own internal maps that I use to understand this space as I'm both experiencing different experiences, but also as I'm talking and doing all these interviews with creators, how do I navigate what they're doing that's new and different? And I want to emphasize that the map is not the territory. This is just the idea that, like, in the real world, you have reality, and then you have some sort of mental abstraction to make sense of it. There's a tendency to think that that mental abstraction is isomorphic or identical to that area. And I just want to say that these maps are imperfect. We're talking about experiences and qualitative dimensions of reality that you could slice and dice any number of different ways. And so this is just the way that I've chosen to slice stuff up. So there's a lot of different memory maps and memory palaces that the ancients have used. And so I find a lot of inspiration for what they have done. And these are just sort of a visual representation of all the different people that I've talked to over the last 3.5 years. So, and I've asked every one of my interviews, what is the ultimate potential of virtual reality? And I find that their answers tend to come into one of these different domains of human experience. Kind of mapped on the left side is self, and the right side is other, and whether it's private or public. And most of the stuff is in entertainment. There's a lot of stuff in, as well as your career. Well, this week we're here at the Enterprise Virtual Reality Summit, so thinking a lot about those applications, medical applications, education, higher education, training, travel, identity. Those are the big ones. The things that I'm going to be kind of like people here are focusing on are these different ones in terms of what you're doing to use virtual reality in your career, to do higher education, to do communications with each other, as well as medicine. And so you have architecture, data visualization, 3D design, engineering, manufacturing, training, virtual teleconferencing, and then medicine. So one other mental model that you can use is left brain, right brain. Is it objective things you can see and measure and observe and quantify, or is it more subjective and qualitative in a way that's a little bit more difficult to put numbers on? And if you go back into the history of visual communications, it started with visual communication with painting on the walls. It was very much a right brain activity, but at some point they started to kind of do a little bit more of a blend and started to do hieroglyphs and symbolic representations of reality. And so eventually they started to abstract it into individual letters, and then you combine those letters and create further abstractions. And so as we've created these higher levels of abstractions, we've been kind of biased as a culture into more the left brain objective and quantitative, and the right brain subjective and qualitative is kind of gone by the wayside. So with the printing press, this was really amplified. So once we have books, then it's really an amplification of all of that ability to capture information and knowledge in a new way. And from that, you have both the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and you have Descartes, who sort of philosophically said there's actually this split between the mind and the body, and that what's happening inside your mind is that subjective is just kind of a different domain, and it's separate. So you have this kind of split between objective mind and science, things you can actually measure, and then the subjective body and the spirit, that's like in the domain of religion, that is kind of separate. And we've kind of still, in a lot of ways, used this as a mental model for how we differentiate our nature of reality. Either you can quantify it and put a number, or if you can't, then it's sort of in a realm of not real, or just kind of like inner or subjective. Well then, as you go through and progress through evolution, you have this explosion of communications technologies, including the camera and film and electricity, grids, and then that eventually leading to computers, and then gaming systems, and then the internet, and mobile gaming, and then mobile phones, and then virtual reality. All of these technologies are experiential technologies. And on the left, you have all the information and knowledge. And on the right, you have ways of starting to capture human experience and increasing levels of fidelity. And so we have this kind of blending of together now. Virtual reality is kind of the nexus point of combining the objective and the subjective, the mind and the body, and the science and the spirit, the things that you can see and measure and put numbers on, and things that you can't. And it's a medium that is combining these things in a new way. So virtual reality is a holistic medium. It's a medium that's actually combining all these things that we weren't able to do before. And because of that, we're able to express things in a lot higher fidelity that's actually a lot closer to how we, as humans, experience reality. So we have this kind of like tension still, though, because most of our things down into their individual component parts and thinking of things as machines. And there's this kind of tension that I still see playing out throughout our culture in many different ways. And so one of the maps that I use is Ken Wilber's integral theory, which tries to do a high level, like from on the left, you have everything that's inside, that's the subjective interior, the right brain, the subjective qualitative, and on the right side, you have the left brain, objective quantitative. And then from the top and bottom, you have the individual and then the collective. And so the interior individual is the psychological, the spiritual. The interior collective is the cultural things. And then the exterior of the individual is everything that you can measure. That's basically empirical science that we have today, anything that you could basically do objective measurements. But that's within the context of a structural system, an economic system, different laws and political systems, all the larger things. So as I get into covering virtual reality, I'm just finding that at some point I start to look at like, well, how is the blockchain going to change how we do economics? How is it going to, what's the underlying, it's almost like the operating system of our society, and is that going to change our laws? And what are the things that you can use virtual reality to start to teach culture, to be able to implement different things that exhibit a culture, maybe with non-player characters or artificial intelligence, so you get a sense of what emergent dynamics may happen, so that you get a sense of the culture before it actually happens. So again, these are all the different four quadrants of the things that you can, the interior of the individual, the interior of the collective, the exterior of the individual, and the exterior of the collective. And you have different sort of lenses. So you have the experience perspective, you have the behavior perspective, you have the culture perspective, and then you have the systems perspective. Now, that's all well and good. However, well, then I guess moving on with Ken Wilber, the next thing that he does is he starts to look at like all the different multiplicities of all the different types of intelligences. And so he looks to like Howard Gardner to look to see how there's multiple intelligences. So how do you start to integrate all these different types of intelligences? And then he starts to say, well, people don't just, they're not static, they actually grow and change over time. And so you have these different models of moral development or evolution, these developmental models. And so this is just sort of a low-level representation of like a moral development where your identity is, you're identifying with yourself, and then you, as you're grow and develop morally. You start to then consider other people and empathize with your family, with your acquaintances, with strangers, until you keep expanding out to your community, the nation, the world, the cosmos. You can keep kind of going in that. And that's kind of what the Spiral Dynamics was, just a model that was starting to then take that both as an individual and collective layer and start to say, okay, how do you start to map these different evolution cycles? And then Ken Wilber combined that with his integral theory, and then you start to see like this super complex and dense mental model and symbolic map of the psyche and the collective culture. And it's great, but at the same time, there's problems with it. One of the problems is that it starts to create a hierarchical mindset, such that if you start to look at everybody and like, well, where are they at on the evolutionary scale, you start to be like, oh, well, I'm better than them because I'm more evolved because of this or that. So that's a problem. And then it actually is still kind of replicating this Cartesian split, because it's saying that the interior and exterior are separate, but in reality, you talk to any neuroscientist and they're like, well, this kind of construct between the left brain and right brain, actually there's a lot more communication in everything you do. It's kind of operating together, and it's kind of like a false construct to say that. The mind-body split, our mind, our consciousness, the placebo effect, our ability to have our beliefs impact our neurology and our immune systems. And so if consciousness is emergent, then why is there downward causation with our belief systems being able to impact our body? Like meditation is a perfect example of an anomaly of some of these ideas. So I think that there's some of that Cartesian mindset, even though it could be a good experience, like a design framework. Again, the map is not the territory, and it starts to break down when it comes to some of these nuanced points. And then you can also start to then label people. Like this is, and I think this is what we're finding a lot in our culture right now, is like, you're black, you're white, you're male, you're female, you're Republican, you're Democrat, all these labels that we put onto people, and once we put that label on people, then we can stop thinking about them because we know who they are. And I think that, again, is a false construct that I think we're trying to get around. So one of the mental models that I've been starting to think about a little bit more is kind of just thinking about flavors, and every individual is a combination of flavors, and we all have a unique taste, and then, but you don't want to eat everything every day, and so you change, and you as a person, you're growing and evolving, so you may have like, your different expressions of yourself and your being in different contexts that you have that are coming out in all different ways, and so you have it's like a panoply of different things that you like to eat, and each person has that, both those things they like to eat, but also things that they are uniquely able to do that no one else in the world can do, and that everybody has something that they can teach you. And so to me, I think this is a little bit more of a holistic and robust model to start to think about that. And the Institute of Noetic Sciences also has an evolution model, but I think it's just kind of boiled down to the essence, and there's a point at the very top where it says you go from I to we. So if any work that you're doing, you're going to originally be focused on yourself, but if you keep growing on that evolutionary scale, eventually you're going to start thinking about other people. Like, how can my work start to make the most impact to the community, to the world, to the entire cosmos? And I think that this model is a little just kind of boiled down. You don't need to get into the nuances, but I think that I find my own experience that this is true. And there's also these different memory palaces and mental models for the ancients that they used in order to kind of like map out all these different ways of kind of looking at things holistically. And so I kind of found that like if you go back and look at some of those mental models, in some ways I've personally found a lot of inspiration in terms of like, well, how can they were thinking about things holistically, so how can we start to think about that holistically? And I found that the most productive framework that I found was just the elements. And I have kind of gone through the different virtual reality experiences, and after talking to the academics and as well as going through a lot of experiences, I just kind of naturally found that these were the different flavors of the quality of being when it comes to different VR experiences. So if you're in a VR experience, you're either feeling some combination of all these things, of mental and social presence, active presence, being able to express your agency, and embodied presence, so the degree to which that you feel like your body's in another place and that you're in another world. And then the emotional presence, just the degree to which your emotions are being engaged in any experience at any given time. And so again, all of these things are happening all at once, all at the same time, and that every experience you have in life as well as in VR is in some combination of these. And so it's the air element, the fire element, the earth element, and the water element. And Aristotle actually had a way of organizing, how do you order these? And then that's what those glyphs are that kind of represent that. And the most dense earth is at the bottom, and then water's on top of the earth. And then that sort of symbolically represents that the earth and water are more receptive. You're actually more taking in and receiving. And then as you have more active energy, it becomes more hot and rising energy. Then you start to have the fire and the air on top of that. And so again, we'll sort of see how that plays out with kind of symbolically using this to look at some of the other communications mediums. But you can look at this from the cone of experience. Is something that at the highest level, you have text and abstractions. And if you're just talking and telling somebody about something, then they're going to be able to get it to a certain degree. But once they start to express their agency and interact with it, then they start to learn it at another level. If you start to engage their emotions in some way, say that you're able to tell a story or engage them in some sort of narrative, then that can actually have, that dramatized experiences starts to take their level of remembering to the next level. And then finally, you have the senses. You have that all of your sensory motor contingencies. If you have all of your senses and your smell and your taste, and you're able to actually engage in things, then that is the most intense experience. And that's what creates memories. And so when you think about training, this is what you're trying to do, is try and give people the most holistic experience of all of that. And the other thing, you have these insights from like the depth psychologists like Freud and Jung, who said, hey, actually about 9% of what goes on is completely unconscious. We're not aware of what's actually happening. And so that 10% of the conscious mind is that like air element, the thinking, and then everything below that, you have habits and behaviors and your emotions and your senses that you may not even be aware of. And there's so many processes of me just speaking the words and you translating what I'm saying, the sound into words, into meaning that you're not thinking about. That's also just happening. And so cognition, you're put it into different environments, and you're able to then recall all of these memories of nostalgia and awe and wonder, because those, just having a symbolic architecture of a place that you're familiar with is enough to like trigger those memories. And if anybody who's done Google Earth VR knows, you go to a place where you grew up and it has the 3D geometry, and then all these memories start to flow back in. And that's just the principle of embodied cognition at work. And so what does it mean to create environments and architectures for you that's going to really hone in that principle of embodied cognition? So if you want people to remember something, then you have to either replicate what is there, or you create these magical memory palaces that are able to like allow you to store a ton of information. And Pokemon Go is an embodied experience in the sense that it's augmented reality, and you're creating a window into another world. And it's a location-based game. And so you have this spectrum of real environment to the virtual environment, and so that sense of embodied presence is that on this spectrum here. And I think that we're seeing stuff that is phone-based AR, and then you have the ability to be completely in virtual reality and bring in mixed reality elements into a virtual world, and then finally into the virtual world. And so this is something that actually this sense of embodied and environmental presence is why VR arcades are going to be so important. That ability to be able to have that augmented virtual reality, to be able to be in a physical space that's big enough to have all these things, to play laser tag and stuff, that we get the passive haptic feedback of actually touching things, and that is going to be something that you can never do at home. And so that level of environmental and embodied presence is only going to be limited for how much you can do in the home, and then it's going to have to go into these very expensive systems in the arcade until all that technology is out there enough and gets cheap enough. But even if it does get cheap enough, you're not always necessarily going to have the space to be able to do all those experiences that we're going to be able to do in a virtual arcade. And then finally, the emotional presence, that's where a lot of the 360 video comes in, and you have the ability to be able to cultivate empathy for people. So as you dial down the ability for you to take action and reduce your agency, you actually amplify the ability for empathy, which is why a lot of the big empathy pieces have been 360 videos. Also, you're able to capture human facial expressions and emotion in a way that you can't do when you try to do a CG. So a lot of people will say, oh, if it's not CG and interactive, then it's not VR. But I say, no, actually, there's things that you can do in terms of emotion that you can never do when you start to do that levels of abstraction. So it's great for storytelling, great for empathy. Virtual reality, if people haven't played it yet, it's probably one of the best experiences in terms of being able to have this combination of interactivity and storytelling and using the 3-dot controller. It's kind of an exploration, but they they do a great balance, and I haven't seen a lot of great examples. That's probably the biggest challenge for any video game is to how do you express agency, how do you interact and engage, as well as tell a good story. And I think that the future of storytelling is going to be immersive and interactive. And so a lot of the film metaphors that we have for narrative, I think we're going to be moving more into video games, and the video games are actually going to be blending more of these elements of storytelling. And it's like where that meets and what that looks like, I think, is a big question. But you can kind of think of it on a spectrum of authored narrative all the way to generative narrative. And on the left side is where you have the completely authored experience, and then the right side is just completely emergent. And so you have these fully traditional stories on the left side to then interactive traditional stories and multiple ending stories, and then you get to the middle where you start to get branching path stories, and then open-ended stories, and then fully player-driven stories. And so this is kind of like the spectrum of storytelling that I see. It's like a good map of what's possible. And you see the traditional 3-act structure here in the authored narrative, and then you start to go into simple branches where you can see it's kind of a linear, where there's one outcome, and maybe you're able to flavor your experience a little bit, but at the end you kind of come back and you converge. And then you start to have like choose your own adventure that has many complex possibilities, which then as an author you have to write all of those, and so you have to write all the different possibilities that then every choice you make exponentially starts to increase. And then you start to have like an open world sandbox, which is more starting to create a probability space, but by the time you get on this side, then the narrative starts to go away, which is why like something like the Grand Theft Auto may have something that it's a great sandbox, but then the narrative components become not as strong. And then eventually you start to get into drama managers who are able to express agency, and then have a drama manager be able to feed you different parts of the interaction. And then eventually you get to the place where you're starting to just think about it more of a probability space of having a conversation with an individual. And at this point, you're generating a personality for an artificial intelligent non-player character where you're able to have a conversation with. And it's more about like, what is the personality of that character and what are the things that you can do? And then the script becomes much more non-linear. So that's at that far extreme. So, again, just this framework of mental and social presence, active presence, and body presence, and emotional presence, to me has been probably one of the richest ways to start to understand the field of virtual reality. And I want to close things up by a little bit, some of the more philosophical questions that I've been getting into, which is, what is reality? And this is a mental model that we all have that we may not fully always look at, but dualism and materialism has this sort of split already, where there's objective, subjective, body, mind, and science and spirit, and idealism and panpsychism are two of the philosophies that start to bring those back together in a way, and as well as holism, and there's tons of different philosophies that are out there. But David Chalmers is a philosopher that sort of poses these different questions. Are virtual objects and experiences, are they real or fictional? Do virtual events really happen or not? And are virtual reality experiences non-illusionary or illusionary? And are experiences in VR as valuable or not as valuable as experiences outside of it? What I would argue is that depending on your metaphysical assumptions, you have different answers to that question. So if you're thinking about materialism, then at the bottom you have physics, and then chemistry, then biology, then psychology, and then consciousness is emergent out of our neurology. And that's sort of like the current view of materialism. And given that, if you're just saying, well, it's emergent, and then you're just tricking your mind, and it's not real. It's just kind of, you're getting tricked. So the virtual objects are fictional, they don't really happen, virtual experiences are illusionary, and experiences in VR are not as valuable as experiences outside of it. But if you start to see something like transcendental idealism, that actually puts consciousness below physics, where you have that consciousness, and then you have the physics emergent out of that, then the chemistry, then biology, then psychology. That is something that is a little bit more of a philosophy from the East, where this starts to say your direct experience is primary. So whatever happens like in your experience, that's the thing that's the most important. So from this, then, of course, then because you're having an experience of it, then it's just as real as any other object. Virtual events do happen, the experiences are non-illusionary, and they're just as valuable as anything else. And I think that virtual reality is this thing that people makes them start to think about these things a little bit more. And to me, it also starts to like get back to like what is reality? Are we living in a computer simulation? And Max Tegmark has a book called Our Mathematical Universe, where he hypothesized that maybe base reality is mathematical, symbolic reality. That's what the Pythagoreans said, that actually, below, at the base level is math and the layer of symbolic reality. And the Neoplatonists say, yeah, well, there's these archetypal ideal forms that are there as well. Which then brings up the question that when you go to sleep at night and you dream, then where do you go? Is that an actual other physical, imaginable realm, a shamanic realm, a psychedelic realm? Is that realm real, or is it something that is emergent from your neurology just firing? And I think that is an open question. It's a metaphysical question that we may never really be able to answer some of these questions. We may not just know, but the idea of panpsychism is interesting to me because it starts to say that consciousness is not only primary, but it's actually universal. It's in every single photon that has an ability to have spin, and that spin is information, and anything that can process information is a degree of consciousness and awareness. And that goes to like the ideas of the Neoplatonists and Anima Mundi that goes back to the ancients, where the primal worldview was that the whole world was conscious in Anima Mundi, the world soul, and that the modern worldview, our current way of looking at things, is that the self is the only thing that's conscious, and that the world is not conscious. So again, these are some of the more metaphysical questions, but I think that virtual reality can actually start to be a little bit of a reality Turing test. Can we start to figure out what the nature of consciousness is? What is consciousness is a little bit of an intractable problem, and maybe as we look at these different things, we'll be able to figure that out a little bit. And I'll go back to the title of this talk, which is The Map is Not the Territory. It could be that virtual reality is an archetypal level of reality that is deeper than this reality that we have right now. Because we're able to have these archetypal experiences with those ideal forms, maybe we're able to just get in tune to ourselves in a way that we can be more centered in our lives. And I think that's a little bit of an open question, that people are going to have these direct experiences and see if that's true for them or not. At a minimum, though, we're going to be able to use VR to be able to create these archetypal experiences that are close enough to reality so that we can start to train people to have these different experiences. And from my perspective, the more I do VR, the more I have cultivated my training wheels for what it means to be present in my emotional and social presence, my active presence, and body presence, and emotional presence. And that is being translated into my life today. So that's what I wanted to leave with you. There's still a lot of open questions with that, but hopefully I was able to provide a little bit of maps that will help you understand virtual reality. So thank you. To that than people of our age. And the other thing is that there's a certain amount of ethical and moral responsibility that content creators have to have in terms of the types of experiences that they're creating and why they're creating them. And that's when you look at the model of the integral model and you start to look at the systems and the structures, there's a lot of economic incentives that companies have to not fully integrate the direct experience of what people have. So there's a guy named Tristan Harris in Silicon Valley who is a design ethicist, and he's been looking at this trend in Silicon Valley through both just kind of hooking people into just like treating these websites as gambling, such that they're kind of hacking in fixed action patterns to optimize time spent on the site. So they're looking at like, if we can make people spend more time here, they're going to be more likely to click on ads, which creates all of these toxic behaviors for how they're treating us. And so Time Well Spent is actually creating an app to say, well, what is your experience of having on Facebook or Snapchat or WeChat or YouTube? And they find that like people reporting, well, I'm happy about a third of the time. It keeps me coming back. But about 2/3 of the time, I feel like unhappy, regretful, used, manipulated. So it's that 2/3 of that direct phenomenological experience that isn't being captured and recorded. And a big reason why is philosophically, again, going back to reductionism and materialism, you can track how much time people are spending to a number, but it's really difficult to say, how are you feeling about this? Because self-reporting something has problems because habits and behaviors and emotions and your perceptions are like a level below your conscious awareness, so you may not even know why you're doing things. So when virtual reality comes in and has all these biometric data and metrics as to why you're doing things, they're going to know why you're doing things better than you will. They're going to understand the nature of your unconscious better than you are. And so the line between thought control and manipulation is going to be like blurred to the point where the line between advertising and thought control is going to be like, that's going to be a really tricky thing to manage. So I sense that there's going to be a larger structural things that as a culture we have to figure out, do we really want to be in a surveillance-based economy that is creating all these negative economic incentives for people to manipulate us? And so that's one dimension of that. And I think the other side of that, though, is that we may actually be at the peak of our dissociation with cell phones and staring off into escaping into other realities and not connecting to other people. And it could very well be that as we have these more immersive technologies that are integrating our full body, all of our emotions, we're actually going to be more present and more able to make those decisions and choices in the moment that is healthy. And that we may actually, with immersive computing and ambient computing, getting away from the peak of the worst of what we have with computing. Or it could get way worse. We're kind of at this turning point where it could go either way. But I think it sort of gets back down to these larger ethics responsibilities that, as a culture, what are we designing?
Thank you.
Hello. So there's this trend that kind of exists with a lot of old technology and new technology, where in developing countries, where like you have an example being like infrastructure for energy. You have oil and gas that we have set up here because we have been using it for years and years and years. And you have the developing countries that never really got into the infrastructure for it, and they're now getting solar panels, or kind of like, skipping a few steps and getting this more advanced, more modern technology integrated. And I was just wondering if what you guys thought of a similar trend. Do you guys imagine a similar trend happening with kind of virtual reality and kind of enterprise and entertainment space, where they're perhaps skipping the kind of TV or little console or like little Game Boys or whatever, and going to virtual or maybe augmented reality for usage in developing countries as well? Does that make any sense? Or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in a way, we've already seen that happen with like cell phones, smartphones in particular. Like a lot of people skip the desktop computing generation and just gone straight to the smartphone computing. And I think we'll see something kind of similar, I guess, with VR and AR in terms of, like, there's no point in kind of walking through the cycles. But what I think is really interesting is the idea of VR and AR opening up the ability to democratize people and how they interact with the digital world. Let me put it this way, sorry, that was a terrible explanation of it. But this idea that, like, okay, we all have cell phones or smartphones now, and what they let us do is everyone now can interact with the computer, right? Like, that's really awesome. But it makes us consumers, not really creators. I mean, aside from like social media posts or whatever, but like to actually do digital work, you right now still need like a desktop or a laptop to actually participate in the IT economy. Now, if we can use VR and AR as an interface and say, hey, you know what, now other people that like to work with their hands, that don't like to, that think more visually or more of the, are they fire? No, more of the, sorry, I don't know what time it is.
Visual?
Yeah, visual.
Like
Fire and air thinkers. But that they can also participate and become creators, then I think that's really powerful. And if we get more people working, thinking, and creating digitally, I think that could be a vehicle for VR and AR, and that might increase the opportunities for the world in that.
To answer your specific question, no, I don't think that AR and VR is going to leapfrog existing communication platforms because it's a new medium. And because of that, it has new affordances. And the way I think of it right now is an analog to the video game industry, where there's mobile gaming, console gaming, and PC gaming. I think there's going to be a similar ecosystem of mobile VR, standalone VR, which is the equivalent of the console, sort of untethered, and then the PC VR, and then an additional one, the arcades, are going to come back, because we still have arcades, but they kind of went by the wayside because you kind of have feature parity when it comes to an arcade you experience in a 2D one versus what you can get at home with the level of experiences that people have. So given that, I think that actually what I see in terms of enterprise specifically is that, in talking to people at the Virtual Reality Strategy Conference, and a number of people in enterprise are actually super excited about the untethered standalone headsets, because that now allows them to do training applications in a level that maybe that standalone headset isn't going to be as good as raw data on your PC because it's not going to be as high fidelity and an immersive experience in graphics. It's going to be lower graphics, but it's going to be easier to deploy in the enterprise in terms of training applications. And so when I saw the Santa Cruz demo at Oculus Connect 4, I was kind of like, yeah, it's not really that much better. It was a shooter, so again, it was like I've played a lot of shooters, and it was a shooter in mobile VR, and it's like, okay, yeah, I can kind of move around a little bit more, make sure I don't ram into anything in my living room. But to me, that wasn't like the real use case. The real use case, I think, is going to be in the enterprise. And so, but the challenge though is that mobile VR doesn't have as good embodied presence. It's like half or third. You don't have your full 6 degree of freedom, so you don't feel like your body's actually there, and your agency is restricted because you don't have like a 6 degree of freedom hand track controllers with the worst mobile VR. So that will continue to grow and evolve, but it's like if you look at technology adoption curves, that has to go slowly with penetrating and getting the technology up to the point where once the mobile experience is as high in fidelity as a 6 degree of freedom positionally tracked experience in PC VR, then I think we'll start to see more. But just from my own mind, I think like 2025 is a year where it starts to reach the level of scale and mass ubiquity, and you get all the platforms out there and all the content distribution channels kind of settled to the point where it's starting to grow. But I would think of it more of like this is the printing press, and it took a long time for us to get to the Library of Congress. And it's going to be a similar thing with VR. It's a new medium, and it's going to take a lot longer to evolve and grow. But there's just so many applications and training in architecture and in the enterprise that it's going to help bootstrap things where the gaming industry may not be as compelling.
So that's a pretty good segue into what I had a question about. It's I'm very interested in training applications for my industry in oil and gas, and so I'm interested in these Windows standalone headsets. You were speaking earlier, Ted, about how the resolution's a little stronger on these, and I was wondering what that was in comparison to. Of course, like you said, text, being able to read text, especially in these like training applications, would be without it, it's pretty much useless.
Yep.
So interested in what that's in comparison to, what it might be better than, and also thought I understood that some of these Windows standalone headsets were 6 degrees of freedom. Is that not right?
Yeah, so just to clarify, the Windows headsets aren't standalone, they're still tethered to a computer, but they do have 6 degrees of freedom, and what we say is they have inside-out tracking, which means you don't need external sensors to set up. So they are still tethered, but of course you can use a wearable computer, like HP has like a backpack computer, so you can be like mobile. And it does work in terms of like you don't have to have sensors around you because it tracks you, and you can actually have a full room scale or world scale experience if you connect it with a HP or any wearable computer. But then taking back to the resolution increase, I was comparing it to the standards right now. So HTC Vive, Oculus Rift, and even the Samsung Gear VR and Daydream, they're all about like 2K, 1.5K-ish resolution. And it's only about like 10 to 15% more in terms of pixels, but then that makes text so much more legible. And then there are actually other companies, there's a company called Varjo in particular, they're creating a headset that's 32K resolution effectively. And so that becomes like retina resolution. So in these industrial use cases, they could be the headset too if you really, really need to increase the resolution. And that should be hitting the market early next year.
And I would say be careful too, 'cause it's actually.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for questions, but thanks Kent and Simtat for being here. I have one favor. If you guys would be so kind, please, would you sign the ITC logo we have over here
Sure.
as our keynote speakers?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me.
And then we have sessions starting right after this, right off of the expo floor. And then we'll break for lunch, and then the expo will be open after that. So please go catch a couple of talks, or go ahead and run to lunch if you guys are ready. No. That's yours. We did record with multiple cameras. I was. Everyone's like, they were like, what? So I figured I needed to make an audio commentary, sorry, an audio cameo. But, yeah.